Before viewing video lessons, it is important to read the textbook using the learning guide as your turn-by-turn directions. Then use the learning guide to take organized notes in your own words with examples and pictures. Chapter 3, The Biological Bases of Behavior. In this particular video, we'll be focusing on the brain. In Chapter 3, we're looking at the biological piece of the biopsychosocial model of human behavior, focusing specifically on the nervous system and the endocrine system. In this video, we're going to continue this by discussing each area of the brain and the key functions in that area. As we discussed previously, the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Within the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. The brain can be further divided into three large areas called the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. We're going to start with the hindbrain. It's designated by the red portions in the picture. The hindbrain is made up of three key structures: the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. These three structures together are our vital life support function center of the brain. Without these particular structures, we wouldn't be able to breathe and have our heartbeat and those sorts of things. The midbrain is made up of the reticular activating system. That's the bluish-purplish portion of the picture. This sits right at the top of the spinal column where it meets the rest of the brain. Sensory functions are its main purpose, so it makes sure all the sensory information from the body gets into the brain properly. One of the interesting things about this particular part of the brain is something called dopaminergic projections. This refers to the neurotransmitter dopamine. If we can stick an electrode into this particular part of the brain and stimulate the cells in this area, it will cause a flood of dopamine into the frontal and prefrontal cortex. And that's part of that reward-based learning we talked about when we talked about dopamine in the neurotransmitter section. The final area of the brain is the forebrain. This is indicated by the green portion in the graphic. The forebrain is the bulk of the brain tissue. But what we're going to do is we're going to take this forebrain and divide it further into smaller sections. So here's our same picture with the forebrain designated by the green, but we're going to actually look at individual structures within this forebrain. The first one we need to talk about is the thalamus. The thalamus is the relay center of the brain. So as you can see, this is where these signals from the reticular activating system are going to bring the sensory information from the body into the brain straight to the thalamus. And the thalamus kind of acts like a traffic cop. It makes sure that all of those signals get to the correct area of the brain and that any signals the brain is sending the body get sent back out the way they need to go. The next structure of the brain is the hypothalamus. Okay, you can see the hypothalamus is very, very close to the thalamus. And this is important because it regulates your basic biological needs. So that would be things like hunger and thirst and temperature control. And so it would be really important for this part of the brain to get sensory signals very quickly so that it can adjust if needed. The other big function of the hypothalamus is it controls the autonomic nervous system, and we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail later on in Chapter 3, and then also in Chapter 13 on stress and health. The next part of the brain is called the limbic system. The limbic system is actually made up of two structures that we're going to talk about. The first one is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is going to be also very, very close to the thalamus, and it's involved in learning and memory. And so those signals coming in from the body are very quickly going to be translated into some sort of memory. The little trick that I always use to remember what the hippocampus does is I always think of it as the hippocampus you go to learn. The other structure in the limbic system we're going to talk about is the amygdala. Okay, and again, these are all really close to the thalamus. The amygdala is the emotional center of the brain. It's where you experience happiness, sadness, pleasure, aggression. It's also a reactionary part of the brain. It's a act first, think later part of the brain. And so being very close to the thalamus, you can sometimes start reacting emotionally to something before you're actually able to logically think it through. The next part of the forebrain that we want to talk about is the cerebrum, and it makes up the bulk of this tissue. It looks kind of wrinkly, like a bunch of worms all squished together. The outer layer of the cerebrum is actually called the cerebral cortex. And when we talked about the electrostimulation of the brain using magnets, this is the part of the brain that's most often able to be activated. This particular part of the brain is also further divided into particular regions. So what we want to do is look at all of the regions that make up the cerebrum. So the cerebrum gets divided into 4 lobes. We're going to start with the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is at the back of the brain. Kind of, if you put your hand on the back of your head, you're inches away from your occipital lobe. Its primary functions are vision and visual memories, so visual processing and memories. Then you have the temporal lobes. The temporal lobes sit kind of underneath and just above your ears, and they handle auditory processing and auditory memories. So things that you hear are processed in those auditory centers. Next, we have the parietal lobes. The parietal lobes sit on top of your head. So if you put your hand right straight on top of your head, you're probably close to the parietal lobe. These lobes handle somatosensory information. So that's going to include your sense of touch, taste, smell, also your sense of place in space. So whether or not you're upright or kind of leaning, and those sorts of things. The last lobe is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is in the very front part of your head. So if you put your hand sort of on your forehead with your palm on your forehead and curl your fingers over the top of your head, you'll be close to where the frontal lobes are. The back part of the frontal lobe is where you have your movement centers. So that's the part of your brain that tells your body to move. The front part of the frontal lobe is called the prefrontal cortex. That's the part right behind your forehead. And that's where you have the executive control system. So every decision that you make, every conscious thought that you have, your personality, the essence of who you are, is housed in this prefrontal cortex. If you were really a giant robot and there was a little man inside you pushing the buttons and controlling you, this is the part of the brain where they would sit. The cerebrum is also divided into 2 halves, so that you end up actually having 2 frontal lobes, 2 parietal lobes, 2 temporal lobes, and 2 occipital lobes. We call these 2 halves of the cerebrum the cerebral hemispheres. They are connected to one another through the corpus callosum, which is kind of a C or U-shaped structure inside the brain. Now, there's been a lot of misinformation about the difference between the right and the left hemisphere. A lot of people think there's very vast differences between them. Actually, the differences are very small. What we do see is that there is a slight edge for the left hemisphere when we're processing verbal information, such as the words you're reading on this slide, the words I'm saying right now, and for the right hemisphere, we see that it has a slight edge when we are processing nonverbal information, such as when you're listening to music or engaging in some sort of physical activity or sport, or when you're just visually recognizing objects. The last thing we want to talk about with the brain before we move on to the peripheral nervous system is this concept of plasticity. Another myth out there is that the brain isn't changeable. And another myth about that is that once you are grown, once you're an adult, you can't grow new neurons. Both of these are completely false. The brain has plasticity or changeability. And what we see is that experience can change the structure of the brain. This is for both good and bad. So right now, you're engaging in a learning experience, and this is creating change in your brain, which will hopefully allow you to learn and remember what you've been working on. If your brain didn't change, then you couldn't learn. It's also bad because when we do things to our brain that are not good for it, that can also change the structure of the brain. Another thing that we know changes the structure of the brain is sensory input. And so if you have a total lack of sensory input, it can actually reorganize the brain. So one way we've studied this is you can actually be born with cataracts. Cataracts are sort of cloudy coverings over the lens of your eye that can make you blind. And we actually have the ability to take those cataracts off. But we have to do it as quickly as possible after the baby is born, because the longer we wait, sometimes the brain has been changed so that we have difficulty processing that visual information. So that sensory input is really important. Another thing that we know is that adult brains can generate new neurons. This is called neurogenesis. And they can actually create new connections between those neurons. The brain has a lot of flexibility, but it does start to decline with age. Particularly after you've finished puberty, the brain is a little less flexible than it is in childhood and adolescence. This doesn't mean you can't change the brain. It just means you have to work a little bit harder to achieve the same results that you may have achieved as a child. This is one reason it's much easier to learn languages when you're young than it is when you are older.